Hello, my name is Nicholas Avila, and today I'll be discussing video game development and developer responsibility. I'd like to start this presentation by giving a little background knowledge as to what this presentation is going to cover. This presentation is going to cover a debate on how responsible video game developers should be in regards to how their product affects the world around them. It's an ethical analysis of how video game development as a whole plays a part in surges of violence that can be found around the world, how rating systems attempt to prevent mature content reaching younger audiences, and how gaming may or may not be linked to gambling and video game addiction found in younger and older audiences today. There has always been a debate over whether or not mature content found in video games have an effect over those who take part in heinous acts such as mass shootings. Politicians and news outlets alike have in the past pinned the blame on video games that contain these themes as being a cause into why these tragedies may be so rampant today. Despite such claims, there are in fact those who counter such stances. One of these people is Andrew Przybylski, a professor of psychology at the University of Oxford. Professor Przybylski had conducted his own study in order to see if there is in fact a correlation between gaming and an increase in aggressive behavior in adolescence. In his findings, he was able to conclude that out of 1,000 teens from Britain, there was in fact no foreseeable correlation between aggressive behavior and the playing of violent video games. What's interesting about these findings is the fact that Britain can be seen as a sort of baseline, seeing how gun violence and the presence of mass shootings is nowhere near as frequent as it is in the United States. Meaning, since there is hardly any correlation between the two that was found in his findings, it is difficult at this point to pin the blame on gaming as an influence for violent behavior, such as mass shootings or similar acts. One may argue that video games should not contain such violent or mature themes in the first place for fear that younger audiences may be affected by their content, and though developers are in fact responsible for what they put into said games, there is in fact a process that has been put into place in order to avoid easy access of games that contain violent and mature content from finding its way into the hands of minors, and that is the Entertainment Rating Software Board, or ESRB. Although there are those who may doubt how well the ESRB scouts and rates their games, before receiving a rating, a game's developers must submit a detailed questionnaire depicting what can be found in-game, themes like sex, drugs, and violence, plus a clip that shows typical gameplay and the most extreme content that can be found in the game, which is then reviewed by a board of raters. Similarly, in Europe, there exists a rating system similar to the ESRB known as PEGI, or Pan-European Game Information. The service rates games based on similar criteria that the ESRB adheres to by leaving it up to a board of raters to determine the appropriate rating to give the game in question. With rating systems in place in most countries around the world, it shows how gaming today is taken more seriously in regard to their content and future audience, much how like music and movies are taken seriously as well when determining what audiences are suitable for the content being distributed. That being said, though developers are responsible for creating games, can they be held responsible for who gets their hands on said games? Since there is a lengthy process put into place in order to prevent adolescents from accessing such content, the same blame can also just as much be held against those who purchase and distribute the content for those deemed unsuitable. And since there are studies that cannot solidly link mature content to aggressive behavior, there can be an observation that since there is no negative consequence, it is ethical for game developers to create games in which contain graphic and mature content. Despite the protections put into place through the influences of ESRB and PEGI, there are some gray areas in which find their way through to children, and that has to do with gambling and video games. In the majority of the world, minors are prohibited from gambling in any form, but when it comes to mechanics such as loot boxes or loot crates, the line in which is considered gambling is becoming smaller and smaller as new ways of implementing this new trend continue and in some cases can be viewed as targeting children. Before delving deeper into the link between gambling and video games, it's important to know what loot boxes are. Loot boxes come in many forms, but in simplicity, a loot box is any form of virtual game of chance that is only accessed through means of physical real-world currency rather than in-game currency. This trend is similar to a real-world slot machine in that one would keep playing in hopes of winning a grand prize. The only real difference is the fact that loot boxes contain in-game items rather than a cash sum. Although there are some games that usually have a means to acquire these boxes without having to pay any real-world currency, by utilizing a slow buildup of in-game credits, it entices players to pay real-world money due to the fact that it would take an extended period of time in order to accumulate a reasonable sum of credits in order to purchase loot boxes in the first place. It revives the debate of whether or not it is developers' responsibility to stay aware of the effects of how they build their games may affect the world around them. In the UK in 2018, it was found that close to 1 million children were exposed to loot boxes in some way, whether it be by console or by means by apps and smartphones or tablets. Though the exposure does not necessarily mean close to 1 million children will develop gambling addictions in their lifetimes, it can be viewed as priming and conditioning children to be familiar with gambling habits at a young age, and though it may or may not be intentional, there still stands the question of whether or not it is ethical for developers to be allowed to keep such features accessible to younger audiences. Similarly to the ethics behind mature content found in games, there is a debate of whether or not it is ethical for developers to create games that feature a gambling-like mechanic, as well as if it is a consumer's fault for allowing children access to the feature. Seeing how the consequences of exposure has potential to develop addictions in the future, at least some part of the practice can be viewed as unethical, seeing how there are potential negative effects. And with a resurgence of up to 50,000 children in the UK taking part in some form of gambling, is it a risk developers should be taking? Another realm of video game developer responsibility to look at through an ethical lens is the realm of video game addiction and whether or not developers should be responsible for how addicting they make their games. While some may argue that developers only intend to make a product that comes from their vision with little ill intent, the ethics of making a game intentionally addicting is a factor in creating games in the present day. Games today are not the same as games that have come out many years ago. As the internet has expanded and access to online features have gradually increased the ease of access of games to the modern gamer, a challenge today for developers is not so much quality, but more so how they can not only stand out in a crowd of an oversaturated market, but also keep the consumer playing the game in the first place. Due to the fact that there is an oversaturated market of video games, developers have implemented certain practices that seem to deliberately entice players to continue to play the game through tactics that seem to enforce the chances of becoming addicted to games, whether or not it is intentional or unintentional. Using the video game addiction support website Game Quitters as a guide, I will highlight some of the tactics and mechanics in which many games today use in order to keep players coming back and continuing to play. Some games that use some of these tactics in order to keep players coming back include the game Fortnite, which is known to have a rather large adolescent player base. As stated before, loot boxes are a simulated form of lottery where the player can use a real-world currency in order to, in a way, roll the dice and see what items they get. Where it becomes a problem is when real value is given to items, such as it is in South Korea, where said virtual items were given the same value as those that are real. Gamers in turn build a collection over time, and for those who may be lacking motivation in the real world, substitute these virtual objects as real worth. Rate of reinforcement is another tactic that keeps players playing. In some games, as you progress, you get what is known as experience points. As you continue to gain and gain, you eventually level up. At first, the game rewards you by gifting you in-game rewards for reaching a milestone. According to GameQuitters.com, to keep players playing, developers will extend how long it takes to level up, thus making it longer to get the same reward, and change the experience rate from fixed to variable, simply meaning you will no longer get an award every single time you level up, but rather you will gain rewards at random intervals. Another tactic is the idea of daily or weekly awards. This is a tactic most mobile and MMO games implement in order to keep players coming back and checking in. Games will make it so that if a player checks in each day, he or she is eligible for better and better prizes, while making it so if they fail to check in within a specific time frame, they will need to start over or risk losing the opportunity for the reward altogether. In-game seasons are a tactic in which developers also use. A season in simplicity is a time frame, much like daily and weekly rewards, in which certain items will only be available, meaning players have a limited amount of time to level up and receive prizes based on whatever theme the season is offering to the player. In games like Fortnite, once the season ends, you may even lose all the experience you have just gained in order to start from square one, the next season where the developer can implement new content in order to keep things fresh and new. Tactics such as the ones discussed can be viewed as methods in which to keep the player playing. This raises questions about the ethics involved in game development and who should be allowed to be marketed towards, especially adolescents, whether or not it was intended by the developers. A video game developer's job in the end is to create their vision and see it come to life on the screen. Like any art form, there is a line that can be drawn in which one must choose what exactly he or she is responsible for. In the case of video game development, it is a tough line for many to draw. Though the content being created is the developer's doing in the end, there is a debate present in how much the developer can possibly be responsible for. Though the developer cannot be held responsible for what people do with the games they create, there is a sense of responsibility in who they market their product to and how they keep players coming back for more. In reality, It will vary from case to case and by region, seeing how many factors come into play with just how much of an influence people allow when taking part in the world's newest great pastime.